You can play Half-Life 2 in VR for free, because you already own Half-Life 2, and you already own a $1,500 piece of proprietary hardware. So all you need to do is download the mod from Steam, clear space on your dirty floor, and set up the magic boxes that don't watch you while you sleep. And make sure your controllers are charged, one at a time, because who owns 2 USB-C cables? Strap in, strap on, and away we go. A quick disclaimer. While I spend a lot of time drawing parallels and making comparisons between Half-Life Alyx and Half-Life 2 in VR, this is not a review or ranking of one over the other. I use Half-Life Alyx because A, I'm discussing Half-Life in VR, B, because even those who haven't played Half-Life Alyx are probably familiar with its mechanics on some level, and C, if you've played Half-Life Alyx, you're probably somewhat inclined to try out Half-Life 2 VR. But why would you play Half-Life 2 in VR when Half-Life Alyx is right there? Well, as you might have guessed, Half-Life 2 and Half-Life Alyx are two singularly different VR experiences, albeit with some strong similarities rooted in Valve's core game design philosophies. The minutiae of this is difficult to explain, but despite the 15-year gap in development, the primary gameplay flow of explore, combat, solve puzzle, explore, combat, solve puzzle is still the driving force, the strength of both games. It's their individual approach to this loop which differs, the different range of tactics and weapons available, and how combat is structured throughout the environments. Half-Life 2 in VR is a less thorough but further fleshed out game than Half-Life Alyx, whereas Half-Life Alyx is a far more controlled, polished, and directed experience. I'm going to be that guy and make a comparison where Half-Life Alyx is Bloodborne or Sekiro, Half-Life 2 VR is more purely Dark Souls or Elden Ring. It's a much less refined and all-around rougher experience, but its broad scope makes the ambition and range of approaches more enjoyable for seasoned VR players. A common complaint about Half-Life Alyx was the scope of gameplay in comparison to Valve's previous Half-Life titles. There's fewer weapons, slower pace, and an emphasis on scavenging rather than exploring. While the game takes about the same time to finish as any other Half-Life game, it feels smaller. The distance travelled is drastically reduced, but the environments to explore are much more detailed. Valve took what elements work strongly in a VR environment and focused on them singularly, making the limited number of options the best versions of themselves, rather than having a wide range of mechanics and tools all being pretty good. This is because Half-Life Alyx is the flagship title of VR. This is what VR needs to be at a bare minimum. In his review of Half-Life Alyx, 2Clicks Philip referred to it as the Half-Life 1 of VR, setting a baseline for what the format should be, but with the hindsight/foresight of knowing what Half-Life 2 is in comparison to Half-Life 1, Half-Life Alyx seems rather unambitious for the time being. Half-Life 2 VR manages not to fill this void, but to kind of reach out over it and let you scrape your fingers on the other side. There's a greater freedom of gameplay offered in Half-Life 2 that would appeal to those who felt the scope of Half-Life Alyx was too tight, or didn't really feel like a Half-Life game. As such, Half-Life 2's core gameplay loop translates well into VR. Not surprising given the simplicity in its construction and the satisfaction of its execution. Scores of mods in the decades prior have proven that these basic rules for fun can be easily tweaked, transformed, and iterated on to develop new forms of gameplay and puzzle design, so it really was just a matter of time before one of these iterations involved strapping 2 mini TVs and an accelerometer to your face. There's something novel about experiencing something in VR that was never intended to be seen this way. In spite of the video game scale, where environments and occasionally props are made about 20 to 30% bigger than how it is in real life in order to be more navigable and identifiable by the player, the timeless art style and level design of Half-Life 2 make it difficult to discern, for the unacquainted of course, whether or not this play space was actually designed for VR. This puts Half-Life 2 VR into an uncanny valley of sorts, in terms of game design and mechanics, but not right in the pit, maybe like here? Yeah. It works well in VR, but you can tell that not everything is as your brain thinks it should be. Regardless, Half-Life 2 VR is legitimately a new way to experience Half-Life 2. Much more so than M-Mod, Dark Life, Mirrored Mod, and certainly more than the Cinematic Mod. Half-Life 2 was never revolutionary to me. I wasn't old enough in 2004 to truly witness the life-changing revolution in game design that it was. and by the time I was old enough to understand the impact that it had, I'd already desensitized myself, playing through it dozens of times. Witnessing exchanges between characters, the voice performances, and facial animation, which still holds up amazingly well today, from a VR perspective, really puts you into the game, and I know it's a VR buzzword, and I hate how people say that, but at least this time, for me, I actually fucking mean it. In the 20th anniversary developer commentary, Valve mentions that they reduced the intended FOV to 75 degrees rather than the standard at the time of 90 degrees, so the players would feel closer and be able to see the characters and animation better. I'd argue that VR takes this even further, allowing you to converse with characters at your own organic distance, while still seeing the incredible animation and performance up close. It really does help put you in the scene. Half-Life Alyx had this advantage too, but with only 2 or 3 character interaction scenes that are much shorter, it makes it hard to ground yourself in the moment before you're thrust back into the action alone. This was the revolutionary experience I was saying I missed out on. The change in perspective but the unchanged content imparts this incredible feeling of familiarity but still gives you a brand new experience. Imagine watching the same movie you've seen dozens and dozens of times, but all of a sudden you're able to move the camera wherever you want. There's also an interesting separation of character physicality when directly comparing to Half-Life Alyx. Combine soldiers are big, beefy, and generally armor-clad. There are a few characters who appear just in clothing, and you aren't allowed close enough for long enough to examine them specifically, but they seem to be slightly larger than normal, or what you would consider normal. Cinematically sized. But not out of scale with the world. Everything is sized correctly relative to everything else. Half-Life 2 VR's characters seem smaller in comparison, but subtly more correct in scale, relative to you as a person. Everyone is smaller and a little bit thinner, which actually works a little better diegetically, as the human population would certainly be at least a little malnourished, but I digress. So even though it's not the same, and probably never will be, playing through Half-Life 2 in VR gives me some small taste of what that epiphany of game design standards must have been like. This is, in no small part, thanks to the immensely talented and dedicated Source VR mod team, who've put in an unbelievable amount of effort ensuring that this isn't just another one of those lazy, flat-to-VR conversions that just make the camera track to your headset. Backdooring VR into a decades-old engine where, at the time of its conception, VR was either a joke, the terrible MacGuffin in a kid's movie, or something so sci-fi that no one took it seriously. Nothing short of inspirational. And on top of all this, the extra effort needed to rework Valve's original gameplay structuring, like look triggers and measures needed to prevent the player from sequence breaking through VR shenanigans, without breaking the original design, phenomenal. There's no other word for it. All of the guns have been reworked to function in VR, even if some of them function far better than others. The sight on the submachine gun actually works, kind of. They've added an iron sights to the AR-2. Each weapon has a unique, interactive reload sequence. Hell, the crowbar even has a functional melee component, another feature left out of Half-Life Alyx. Valve has stated several good reasons for this, and I can support at least some of them with proof.
A heavy
Hand.
injury.
As a side note, I have done this many times now, and not once have the index controllers lost the battle. Quality hardware, Valve. In fact, all the weapons are physically simulated, so you can push props, peek through windows, and shoot around corners accurately. Even melee works very well. Hand.
Is injured.
Swinging the crowbar is one of the most satisfying things ever, helping cement Half-Life 2 VR's effects on your brain very early on. Swinging at manhacks is such a basic but involved activity that even their preset damage animation feels like they're realistically bouncing off the crowbar. A task that I consider arduous in flat Half-Life 2 is one of my favourite things to do in the VR version. Although naturally not everything is perfect, there are some quirks of the physics engine making things wig out. Two-handing guns can be a little awkward, especially when aiming directly up or directly down. There's no weight simulation or motion damping when moving more weighty equipment, and you'll occasionally grab a prop accidentally and wonder where the fuck your hand has gone. I occasionally find myself missing when I reach back for more ammo, as the backpack collision zone isn't always where you think it is, but aside from these minor things, everything feels complete, diegetic, and intentional. And because all these weapons are physically rendered, they cast shadows from the flashlight, so you can get some pretty unintentionally badass shots when you're done beating manhacks to death with the crowbar. All of Half-Life 2's mechanics translate so well into VR, partially because of the familiarity with base Half-Life 2, but also because base Half-Life 2 makes sense in a way that you aren't really actively aware of, because if you were aware of it, then it wouldn't be making sense. For example, lifting a crate or a prop and then dropping it makes it fall and then creates a sound. Within the fiction of the video game, these actions are consistent, accurate, and repeatable. Hit a box with a crowbar, it makes a wood noise. Hit it again, it explodes into bits of wood with more wood noise. In this case, the physics simulation grounds the player's actions into categories of expectation. Again, you don't notice how well this works because if you noticed it, it wouldn't be working well. This subliminal effect is key to Half-Life 2's long-standing claim to realism. So, slap this whole system into VR and you've got a contextually believable simulation not just of physics, but of your whole game world. That said, some facets of Half-Life 2 don't translate perfectly. While you have the option of climbing ladders just by walking into them, like classic Half-Life, ladder behaviour can also be done physically, similar to Half-Life Alyx, which I much prefer. Although, for the most part this is fine, there are some absurdly long ladders in this game, so for some places you're just left staring at the ceiling, waving your hands in the air, mimicking ladder movements. What a thrill. Half-Life Alyx spends time training players not just how to play the game, but how to behave in and expect a VR world to behave in response to them. Similar to the beginning of Half-Life 2, demonstrating the physics simulation right off the train, Half-Life Alyx gives the player a little VR playground to experiment with before beginning the game proper. Half-Life 2 VR essentially relies on the player having prior knowledge of Half-Life 2 and how it functions, the player at least having basic experience in VR environments, or ideally having played or have seen Half-Life Alyx before. While I loved every second of it, I wouldn't recommend this for someone's first time in VR. Because in the context of Half-Life Alyx, you the player inhabit/embody Alyx. Her movement is limited to yours. You can't sprint everywhere or carry the average American household of weaponry wherever you go, with ammo in tow. You are limited by the constructed fiction of the game world, which was built with the context of VR in mind. Half-Life 2, on the other hand, drops this premise entirely. Realism be damned. I'm Gordon fucking Freeman. I'm carrying more gear than an analogy. Your movements are not a limitation, they're a baseline. With the facet of VR being in the passenger seat of this VR game, it's left free to be engaging in a more traditional video game sense. I'm still unsure as to whether this is a form of progress or regress in terms of VR game design, however, it's fun as fuck, so I don't care. It does have some pretty significant downsides, however. The strong appeal of Half-Life Alyx was the approachability of the gameplay. It was designed for anyone to pick up and play. It can be finished one-handed, sitting down, teleporting, or constant locomotion. Everyone and their mum can play Half-Life Alyx. The same cannot be said for Half-Life 2 in VR. You move much faster than you can in real life. You're turning around more, switching between different weapons more often, and solving puzzles with more conventionally flat tools and less conventionally VR tools. On top of this, Half-Life 2 VR is significantly more exhausting to play, both physically and mentally. And as I said before, this can be a little much for the unacquainted in VR, but still very enjoyable for long-time players. One of the more obvious contrasts between Half-Life Alyx and Half-Life 2 VR is that Alyx's levels are much denser. The environments are designed to be meticulously analysed, appreciated, and lingered in. This is due to Half-Life Alyx being a more responsive, interactive display of granular detail and visual fidelity. Everything is specifically designed to be picked up and looked at. Each room is intricately arranged to not only be as realistic but as presentable as possible. In contrast, Half-Life 2 is more so a broad display of strong artistic direction and seamless world construction, rather than intricate detail. The environments are designed to be looked at and understood at a glance, with the detail present enhancing the scene rather than being the centerpiece. To put it short, Half-Life Alyx's world is designed to be analysed, where Half-Life 2's is meant to be examined. This works in Half-Life 2's favour because of its much more rapid pace of gameplay. Get in, grab that health pack, and get out. Be on your way. This drastic difference in level design between the two games highlights some of the key differences in gameplay. With the novelty of VR not being a factor in Half-Life 2's original design, the VR version allows the player to disengage with the gimmick of VR, and explore the less realistic, more traditional video gamey aspects of its design, rather than forcing them down the barrel of an elaborately crafted VR experience. Neither of these approaches is inherently superior, it's simply two different ways of constructing a VR game. One last interesting note is that Half-Life Alyx and Half-Life 2 are somewhat derived from one another. In the developer commentary for Half-Life Alyx, it's mentioned that the very earliest prototypes of Alyx's gameplay utilised a lot of Half-Life 2's assets. Existing enemies and maps were simply loaded up and tested in VR. This is especially obvious when comparing the combat and scale of the leggies between games. In a weird way, Half-Life 2 could very well be what the earliest versions of Half-Life Alyx were like. Gameplay evolved from here and slowly became the Half-Life Alyx we all know and love. Some of the gameplay elements, such as the projected weapon selection system, the health and status on the hands, and reaching over the shoulder for more ammo, would find their way into the Half-Life 2 VR mod. While not exclusive to either of these games, it's comforting to have this level of synergy between two largely unrelated development teams. On a more subliminal level, the Half-Life 2 VR releases come with their own instances of achievements. While they're the same as base Half-Life 2, there's some wonderful combination of nostalgia and accomplishment from re-earning them all. Like, I remember throwing grenades back at Combine soldiers trying to get a kill 10 years ago. It brought back some memories. Especially the more physicality-based ones, like going through Ravenholm using only the gravity gun, or going through sand traps without summoning the antlions. These are ostensibly harder to get in VR, so there's this subtly deeper sense of accomplishment that, when combined with the nostalgia, that just adds an additional layer of fun for those who care about achievements. However, defending all the structures from the Striders at the end of Episode 2 sucks even harder now. Episodes 1 and 2 have VR counterparts as well. On my first run of Episode 2, I opted to do the Gnome achievement. This was, without a doubt, one of the most asinine decisions I have ever made. Keeping that fucker in the car is bad enough in standard Episode 2, but having to get out every 6 seconds, look around for this bitch, gravity gun him back into the car, all in VR, all while getting shot at by the chopper, was one of the most infuriating, obtuse, and maddening undertakings of my life. The obvious joke here is to now say 10 out of 10 would recommend, but I don't. I'd rather piss glass than do that again. Fuck you. Anyway. The benefit of experiencing/re-experiencing Half-Life 2 in VR is the new layer of physicality, being closer to the action. Sequences like traversing the underside of the bridge during Highway 17 become far more precarious and dangerous having to slow down in VR, compared to my usual 19-second speedrun from point A to point B, which is actually something I've noticed throughout the entire game. You're kind of forced to play a lot slower than you would in flat Half-Life 2, and to someone who's played, replayed, and re-replayed dozens of times in the past decade, I find myself rediscovering old things I had long since forgotten about. Hidden weapon and supply caches, little bits of scenery, or even just stopping to admire the landscape and level design one more time. It really hits different when you're going through it at the intended pace. This also massively enhances all the cinematic moments, like arriving back in Kleiner's lab after escaping Nova Prospekt, taking out the gunship in the hospital attic in Episode 1, and, most memorably, the antlion tunnel defense in Episode 2. If anything at all, needs to singularly justify the existence of Half-Life 2 having a VR mod, It's this. Crank the music, load the guns, and prepare yourself for something that thoroughly transcends Valve's original vision. It's places like this where the new perspective of VR really shines. The adrenaline rush, the pounding music, Griggs and Shackley yelling at each other, it's just on another level. On the other end of the spectrum, but another great example, is Ravenholm. Ravenholm was never a particularly scary place to me, even on early playthroughs when I was young. Ravenholm's core appeal then becomes atmosphere, an appreciation for the tone, the lighting, the level design, the music, all of which is conveyed even more effectively in VR. While Half-Life Alyx wins overall in terms of visual fidelity and survival horror, I think Half-Life 2 is more consistently fun in these aspects. This is primarily due to the increased maneuverability and the broader range of available weapons, and of course, the gravity gun. The direct comparison would be to Jeff and the Distillery, although I don't think that's a fair weighting. While they're both horror-centric interludes to otherwise action-centric stories, Jeff relies more heavily on the psychological aspect. What if I get caught by him? I have no way of fighting back. I have to avoid Jeff. Oh my god, he's right there! However, in Half-Life 2, Ravenholm itself is the enemy. There's no risk of getting caught because you already have been. All of the enemies know where you are, and while you have the tools to survive, they must be used and managed effectively. There's not really any resource management with Jeff because the environment gives you enough to consistently succeed. As such, the Ravenholm section works much better in VR than it does flat, especially when contrasted with a prior playthrough of Half-Life Alyx and a run-in with Jeff. I think it works so much better because there's a lot more tonal contrast overall throughout Half-Life 2. There's mystery, suspense, heightened action, grandiose set pieces, and horror in both games, but Half-Life Alyx blends between these so well that you don't really notice it when it changes. The tone of the whole game seems to blend into a single linear experience rather than distinctive memorable sections like Half-Life 2, at least for me. Again, neither of these is a superior or inferior method, it's just two different ways of conveying a story and tone. On the topic of tone, having Alyx as a companion throughout Episode 1 and especially Episode 2 was one of the things that briefly broke my brain and obfuscated the veil that separates the virtual world from my shitty real world. Seeing the Hunter attack her, the Vortigons heal her, and having her ride shotgun as we race to White Forest was an immensely enjoyable experience, because you really do feel like you aren't alone. It feels like someone here has your back and is watching out for you. In turn, you feel like watching out for her, because the character is there, more tangible than ever. Being able to interact with Alyx on this deeper level sells the camaraderie between her and Gordon in ways that Flat Half-Life 2 never could. Ways that drastically change the tone of Episode 2, which makes the cliffhanger at the end just as gutting as it was when I saw it for the first time 10 years ago. In Half-Life Alyx, you can live out your fantasies of pressing elevator buttons like your favourite white male video game protagonist. In Half-Life 2 VR, you can throw up getting into a virtual airboat. Truly innovative times we live in. I've been playing VR for quite some time. In fact, this footage was recorded from a first-generation HTC Vive, which I've had since about release. As such, I have very strong VR legs, but the vehicle segments are the strongest reminder that Half-Life 2 was not designed for VR. While the mod developers have given you a very wide range of options to avoid severe motion sickness, there is very little in the way of actually avoiding severe motion sickness. In Half-Life 2's 20th anniversary developer commentary, the designers mentioned that the vehicles went through a number of iterations in order to reduce motion sickness when playing, chiefly pulling more and more components off the vehicles to give the player a greater field of vision, eventually realizing that motion sickness was drastically reduced when the player was able to see the ground beneath them. In the non-comfort vehicle setting, which is the truest to the original Flat experience, and also looks the best, when you're seated in the airboat or the buggy, you're actually sitting far further back than you do in the Flat version. This, either inadvertently or probably intentionally, gives you that wider field of vision, helping with the motion sickness. This mod was released before the commentary was, so it's interesting, again, watching two development parties reach the same conclusion on this matter. Regardless, the mod developers give you a solid range of comfort options, ranging from the true Half-Life 2 VR experience to a third-person camera to a static 2D window. It's really nice they've tried to be as inclusive as possible, because I know some people personally who would not be able to make it past water hazard. Being intimately familiar with Half-Life 2 also helps, in so much as that you reduce the amount of time you spend in the vehicle. But even moving around in Gordon mode can be a little sickening, especially with some of these long spiral staircases like the lighthouse battle or the bank. Thankfully, the developers have added some options which should be standard fare in any VR experience, such as snap turning, a movement vignette, or teleport locomotion. There are some elements that you will have to brute force your way through, however. Alyx's introduction is staged strangely, so that you have to be looking up and to the ceiling to catch the performance.
Dr. Freeman, I presume. I better hurry. The Combine...
Although, logically, I don't see any better way to do this without some sickening camera movements. The ride through the Citadel is pretty unpleasant, but, nothing is stopping you from just sitting down and having a snack while it happens. You've seen it all anyway. And Dog throwing you and Alyx in the car at the start of Episode 1 is also pretty rough. So much so that the developers put a little warning message saying, if you get motion sickness, close your eyes until it's over. But this can play into your ability to physically inhabit Gordon with a bit of contextual role-playing, which I'll get into a little more later. I mean, logically, if I'm about to paint the floor with my lunch, then so would Gordon. Even some controlled elements can be pretty rough. Ignoring the motion sickness from actually driving, constantly having to get in and out of the car to get Magnuson devices for the Strider defense at the end of Episode 2 has you constantly whipping around, cutting to black, running back and forth. Sadly, if you don't save scum, the encounter ends up being tedious, nauseating, and worst of all, not fun. The user interface has been redesigned for comfort and utility in the VR environment. Taking inspiration from Half-Life Alyx's simple up, down, left, right weapon selection, Half-Life 2 VR expands on this concept by having a neat little honeycomb grid for your equipment. Although, if I'm being honest, it does get a little confusing once you fill out your arsenal. I would have much preferred a structured layout more similar to the controller UI in standard Half-Life 2, but there are some nice touches, like tapping the inventory button once to quickly equip and unequip your last weapon, which was also taken from Half-Life Alyx. And the fact that the crowbar is always at the bottom. Very simple downwards motion and you always know what you're going to get. Small quality of life additions go much further in cases when controller environments are limited or unfamiliar. As I said before, the work on remaking all of these weapons in VR is nothing short of incredible. Here's a fun fact. Valve's dedication to optimization in Half-Life 2 meant that a lot of the view models are not fully corporeal. This means that all of the weapons you use in VR have to have been retouched or remodeled, adding missing geometry and details. It's probably more accurate to say that most, if not all, of the weapons were completely replaced. Custom animations used for cocking, loading, and firing, each of which has its own new interactive replacement. Ammo left in magazines before ejecting is left on the ground, although it can be retrieved if you remember. This additional element to the gunplay adds more layers to each firefight, as switching between weapons now has the additional consideration of, how long will this take for me to reload? Did I even leave this one loaded? Or, oh shit, I forgot to chamber around and now I'm fucked. This is just one of the great things that changed the VR experience of Half-Life 2 significantly, but still not fundamentally. All of the core Half-Life systems are still there, it's just from VR you approach them from a different perspective. Sprinting is much the same as the flat version, although I have heard of some people getting queasy from the sudden changes in movement speed. Crouching works similar to Half-Life Alyx, where you can physically crouch if you want, but there's a binding to make it button toggleable. Your flashlight is head-bound rather than hand-bound, which can be a little off-putting at first, but is something you quickly get used to. It's also manually toggleable by pressing an imaginary button on the HEV suit near the neck. I love the extra details that are added with small features like this, as again, it just helps you ground yourself into the world that little bit more. And because of the complete change in perspective and approach, you're able to look at puzzles in a new light, or simply solve them more efficiently. Like here, you can sit on top of the bank turrets and follow Freeman and just kind of pop grenades down there. You can twist the gravity gun holding the panel at the start of episode 1 so you don't have to do this awkward crouch shuffle down the tunnel. As I've said many times now, VR is a completely fresh way to play Half-Life 2, even if it's just for the novel experience of VR itself. But there's an additional element that I haven't talked about yet. Everyone has their own Gordon Freeman. Whether it's the neurotic chatterbox of Freeman's mind,
Yeah! Kick his ass! No, you're doing it wrong! Huh?
The panicked and confused companion of the self-aware AIs,
What are you screaming about? What are you Gordon, look out!
the desperate, confused loner running only on adrenaline seen by some of the community, or your own personal take on the character. The silent protagonist and relaxed, ambiguous interactions with the characters of the Half-Life universe make projecting yourself onto Freeman an easy task for the player. I am Gordon Freeman, and he is who I am. Half-Life 2's silent adventures of Dr. Freeman left you free to project your own personality onto Gordon, as each situation you're presented with changes with the context of who is playing him. The VR perspective gives you even more freedom to better inhabit Gordon. Is he desperate? Zany?
Yes.
Exhausted? Terrified? Is Alex just a really good friend? It's much more for you to decide than ever before, as the simple acts of nodding in agreement, resting a virtual hand on a character's shoulder, or holding on to something for dear life, I find are far more immersive than some of the story-heavy moments of Half-Life Alyx. Mainly because this engagement is, true to Valve's intended vision, voluntary and completely optional. You can engage with the role-playing element of VR, you can have Gordon nod in agreement, cock a shotgun dramatically, or raise a gun to accentuate the drama of a scene, or just ignore it. You can do what you want. This is Half-Life 2. Sadly, you don't have this freedom in Half-Life Alyx, because Alyx is already a character without the player's persuasion. And because Half-Life Alyx is more concerned with the physicality, the simulation aspect of VR. They want you to feel like the Alyx they've made, who's real and in this moment. Opening doors by hand, crouching under obstacles, climbing ladders. Hell, even having the Steam controllers strapped onto your hands either intentionally or unintentionally mimics the minor discomfort Alyx must feel from having the gravity gloves strapped to her hands. Although I can similarly excuse behaviour like adjusting my headset in Half-Life 2 as Gordon adjusting his glasses. This may be unique to me, but I still find it an interesting observation. The more or the harder you try to immerse a player in an experience or a setting, the harder the less willing players will push back. Because immersion is a voluntary act. Give the players the tools for immersion, an invitation to participate, and a flexible role to fill, and they will immerse themselves much further than they can be forced.
Think it's dead? Maybe you should whack it with a crowbar just in case.
Because of this, I often find myself play acting, little small motions like holstering a firearm or placing the rocket launcher on my back while simply unequipping it through the menus. It's little touches like this that I can choose to engage with that enhance the depth of gameplay to include small facets of roleplay, which just makes the whole experience much more fun. I can select the level of engagement I have with the story, the VR gimmick, the characters, and all my weapons on an individual level.
A combine zombie. That's like a zombine, right? Zombine, get it? Okay.
Ironically, because of my voluntary engagement with this emergent form of gameplay, I find myself extremely physically exhausted after a while, which feeds back into the roleplay element. Gordon may have the HEV suit. He may be fueled purely by adrenaline, morphine, and antlion goo, but he's still human, and we get tired, which is generally a good indicator that maybe it's time to take a break and have a nap. There's so much more to talk about, but it's either not coming to mind or I'd be repeating myself even more just trying to get there, so let's try and wrap this up. Go try Half-Life 2 VR. As far as I'm aware, it works on pretty much all modern VR systems, even completely outdated ones like mine. It's incredibly fun, extremely rewarding, and a nice nostalgic breath of fresh air for those like me who've played it time and time and time again. It's a testament to Valve's timeless game design and art direction, and a love letter from fans who will do almost literally anything to extend the longevity of this game even further. It's a game very much designed for VR users, not concerned with the abstract novelty of neither the VR experience nor the true immersion that many VR games try to engage with. For a sheer lack of a better phrase, Half-Life 2 in VR is self-aware. It knows exactly what it needs to be, which elements of the original game need to push and stretch, which need to be constrained, and most importantly, which ones need no alteration at all. It understands the concept of its own novelty. It simply is Half-Life 2, but in VR. Nothing more, nothing less. So, do yourself a favour, and give it a go if you're able. Cheers.